The marshal's boot connected with her ribs before she could even finish her sentence. Abigail Harper hit the saloon floor hard, dust and sawdust filling her mouth, 30 men watching, not one of them moving to help her. She had come seeking justice. She got humiliation instead. "Please, someone help me." She choked out blood on her lip, certain no one in that godless town would ever answer her cry. She was wrong. If you're watching this from your favorite chair tonight, drop your city in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next changes everything. The boot came without warning. Abigail didn't even see Marshal Dale Whitfield move before his heel slammed into her side and the world tilted sideways into dust and sawdust and the stink of spilled whiskey. She landed hard on her hip, the old leather satchel skidding away from her outstretched hand, her father's deed spilling half out of it onto the filthy floorboards. Somebody laughed. Abigail pressed her palm flat against the boards, trying to push herself up, and the room spun. 30 faces. 30 pairs of eyes. Not one hand reaching down to help her. "Get up." Whitfield set his voice flat, almost bored, like he was talking to a dog that had wandered somewhere it didn't belong. "Get up and get out of my town before I drag you out myself. I only wanted—" Abigail started, but her voice cracked and she hated herself for that. Crack hated that, even now, even on the floor, with her ribs screaming. Some part of her was still trying to be polite. Still trying to be small enough, quiet enough, easy enough that somebody, anybody would finally listen. "I don't care what you wanted." Whitfield crouched down, grabbed a fistful of her collar, and hauled her halfway up before letting her drop again. Pain shot through her shoulder. "I've had enough of you. 3 days you've been pestering me about some land claim nobody cares about. Your daddy's dead. His land's gone. That's the end of it." "It is not the end of it." Abigail's voice came out stronger than she expected, even with blood at the corner of her mouth, even with her hair falling loose from its pins. "He registered that valley. I have the deed right here. That paper's worthless." Whitfield kicked the satchel further away, and a man near the bar laughed again, low and ugly. "Worthless same as you." Worthless. The word hit harder than the boot had. Abigail had heard that word her whole life, in 100 different mouths, said 100 different ways. She'd heard it from suitors who looked at her size and turned away before she'd even finished introducing herself. She'd heard it from her own aunt, who'd told her plainly that a woman built like Abigail had no business hoping for anything beyond what she was given. She'd heard it from lawyers in 3 different towns who'd glanced at her paperwork, and found reasons to send her away without ever truly looking at either. But she'd never expected to hear it on the floor of a saloon, with her father's deed 3 years in the chasing, with everything she had left in the world spread out in the dirt in front of 30 silent strangers. "Please," she said, and she hated the word, even as it left her mouth, hated how small it sounded, how much it cost her to say it. "Please, someone help me." Silence answered her. Not one man at the bar moved. Not the bartender, who suddenly found something fascinating to study in the bottom of a glass he was wiping. Not the gamblers at the corner table who exchanged glances and went back to their cards like nothing at all was happening 6 feet away. Not the 2 cowhands by the door who'd gone quiet and still eyes anywhere but on her. Fear did that to a town. Abigail understood that now in a way she hadn't before. Whitfield wasn't just the marshal. He was the marshal because the men who owned this town wanted him there, wanted somebody mean enough and crooked enough to keep folks in line, and everybody in that saloon knew it. Helping her meant crossing him. Crossing him meant trouble nobody wanted, so nobody moved. Whitfield straightened up, adjusted his hat, looked down at her like she was something he'd scraped off his boot. "You hear that?" he said loud enough for the whole room. "Nobody's coming to help you. Nobody in this town's gonna lift a finger for some fat girl crying about a piece of paper. You understand me now, you're done here." He raised his boot again. That was when the chair scraped. It was a small sound, almost lost under the murmur of the saloon, but it cut through everything anyway, because nobody in that room had moved in over a minute, and now somebody was moving. Abigail turned her head, ribs aching, and saw him. He'd been sitting in the darkest corner of the saloon the whole time, far enough back that the lamplight barely reached him. still enough that she hadn't even registered another person was there. Now, he was standing. He was big, the kind of big that made the room feel smaller, just by him being upright in it, shoulders wide enough to block the lamp behind him, a few days of beard shadowing a jaw set hard as stone. His hat sat low over his eyes, but even in shadow, Abigail could see he was looking directly at Whitfield. The marshal saw him too, and something in Whitfield's face changed. "This ain't your business, Ashford," Whitfield said, and for the first time since Abigail had walked into that saloon, there was something other than cruelty in his voice. There was caution. Ashford. Abigail didn't know the name, but she watched the way every man at the bar suddenly found reasons to look elsewhere. Watched the bartender set down his glass without a sound. Watched the gamblers in the corner go entirely still. "Step back from her," Ashford said. His voice wasn't loud. That was the strange thing about it. He didn't shout, didn't posture, didn't do any of the things Whitfield had been doing for the last 5 minutes. He just spoke quiet and even, and somehow it was more frightening than any amount of yelling could have been. "I said this ain't your concern," Whitfield said again, but he didn't sound certain anymore. He sounded like a man working hard to convince himself. "I'm making it my concern." Ashford took a step forward out of the shadow, and the lamplight caught his face fully for the first time. Abigail saw weathered skin a scar through one eyebrow, eyes the color of a winter sky, and something in those eyes that looked older and harder than the rest of him. "Step back from her, Marshal. I won't ask twice." Whitfield's hand drifted toward his own holster, an instinctive thing, the kind of motion a man made when he'd worn a gun so long it was part of his arm. Ashford's hand moved at the exact same moment, settling on the grip of his own revolver, not drawing, just resting there, just letting everyone in the room see that he could. The saloon went silent, in a way it hadn't been silent before. Even the silence from a minute ago, the cowardly silence of men looking away, was different from this. This silence had a held breath in it. Abigail lay on the floor between them, blood drying at the corner of her mouth, and watched 2 men decide whether or not somebody was about to die in front of her. "You don't want to do this, Ashford," Whitfield said. His voice had lost all its earlier swagger. "You know who backs me in this town. You know what happens if you cross them. I know exactly what happens." Something flickered across Ashford's face, gone too fast for Abigail to name it. "I've known longer than you have." Whitfield's hand hovered near his gun. Another second, 2 seconds, 3. Abigail counted them in her own heartbeat, felt each one in her bruised ribs. And then slowly the marshal's hand drifted away from his holster, and he took a step back. "This ain't over," Whitfield muttered. But he was already moving toward the door, already calling for 2 of his men to follow him, already trying to salvage what was left of his authority by walking out like it had been his choice. The saloon doors swung shut behind him with a hollow bang. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. Then Ashford crouched down in front of Abigail, slow and careful, the way a man might approach a wounded animal he didn't want to spook. Up close, she could see he wasn't as young as she'd first thought, maybe mid-30s, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors in weather and trouble. "You hurt bad?" he asked. Abigail tried to laugh, but it came out as a wince instead. "I've had worse." "That ain't an answer." He held out a hand, and she stared at it for a moment. This hand offered to her without hesitation, without disgust, without any of the things she'd grown used to seeing on men's faces when they looked at her. "Can you stand?" She took his hand. His grip was steady, strong enough to pull her up without her having to do most of the work herself. And for a moment, standing there in front of him, she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt seen. Not judged, not measured and found wanting, just seen the way any other person walking into that saloon might have been seen. "Thank you," she said, and her voice cracked again, but this time it wasn't from weakness. It was from something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for yet. "Don't thank me yet." Ashford bent down and retrieved her satchel, handed it back to her with the same careful steadiness. "Whitfield's gonna come back madder than he left, probably bring more men next time." He paused, studying her face for a long moment. "What's your name?" "Abigail. Abigail Harper." Something shifted behind his eyes at the name, just slightly like a man recalculating something in his head. "Harper," he repeated. You any relation to Thomas Harper? Abigail's breath caught. He was my father. You knew him? I knew of him. Ashford's jaw tightened. Heard he found something up in the High Valley a few years back. Heard he died not long after. He looked at her satchel, at the deed half spilled out of it onto the floor, and something hardened in his expression. Something that looked almost like recognition. You got that deed with you. It's all I have left of him. Abigail bent down, despite the pain in her ribs, and gathered the loose papers, pressing them back into the satchel with trembling hands. I've been trying to get anyone to look at it for 3 years. Every lawyer turns me away. Every official tells me the land's already sold, already settled, nothing to be done. Her voice shook. I just wanted somebody to listen. That's all I wanted today. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. You didn't cause this trouble. Ashford's voice was low, almost grim. This trouble's been here a long time before you walked in. You just happened to walk into the middle of it. Abigail looked up at him confused, but before she could ask what he meant, he was already glancing toward the saloon doors, toward the street beyond where Whitfield had disappeared. We can't talk here, he said. Whitfield's not done, and there's eyes in this town that report back to people worse than him. He looked at her directly, that winter sky gaze, steady and unflinching. I've got a place up the mountain, safe, quiet. Nobody bothers me up there, not even Whitfield. He paused, and for the first time something almost like hesitation crossed his face. I know you don't know me from Adam, and I know it's a strange thing to ask a woman to ride off into the mountains with a stranger, but if you want answers about your father's land, I think I might be able to help you find them. And if you stay in this town tonight, I don't think Whitfield's gonna let this go. Abigail looked around the saloon at the men who still wouldn't meet her eyes, at the bartender wiping the same glass over and over, at the gamblers who'd gone back to their cards as though nothing had happened at all. She thought about 3 years of doors closing in her face. 3 years of being told her father's death and her father's land were not her concern, not anyone's concern. Simply gone, simply finished. She thought about the way this stranger had stood up when nobody else would, had put his own hand on his gun for a woman he'd never met, had looked at her like she was a person and not a problem to be kicked out the door. All right, she said. I'll come. Ashford nodded once like the matter was settled and reached down to help gather the last of her scattered papers. As they stepped toward the saloon doors together, Abigail felt the weight of every eye in the room following them, felt the silence pressing in from every direction. But for the first time since she'd ridden into Black Ridge, she didn't feel entirely alone in it. Outside, the evening air was sharp and cold against her bruised skin, and the street was empty except for a few lit windows and the distant shape of Whitfield disappearing around a corner with his men. Ashford led her toward a horse tied at the edge of the street, a large dun gelding that nickered softly at his approach. You ride? He asked. Not well. Abigail admitted, glancing at the horse, at her own bruised side, at the long shadow of the mountains rising dark against the evening sky. But I'll manage. I'll keep the pace slow. Ashford swung up into the saddle with an ease that spoke of years of practice, then reached down a hand for her. She hesitated only a moment before taking it, and he pulled her up behind him with the same steady strength he'd shown inside the saloon. Hold on. It's a few hours up and the trail gets rough toward the top. Abigail wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him even through the cold evening air, and as the horse started forward, she looked back once at the lights of Black Ridge fading behind them. She didn't know yet what waited for her in the mountains, didn't know how deep the conspiracy around her father's land truly ran, didn't know that the man carrying her away from that saloon had his own buried history with the very corruption that had stolen everything she had left. All she knew was that for the first time in 3 years, somebody had finally listened. And as the trail climbed higher into the dark pines and the lights of the town shrank to nothing behind them, Abigail Harper held on tight and let herself hope just a little that her father's truth might finally see daylight. The trail climbed for 2 hours before Ashford finally slowed the gelding to a walk, and Abigail felt every one of those hours in her bruised ribs. Almost there, he said over his shoulder. Cabin's just past this ridge. You said that an hour ago. Did I? There was something almost like humor in his voice, the first hint of it she'd heard since the saloon. Guess I did. Abigail tightened her grip around his waist as the horse picked its way over loose rock, the darkness pressing in close on either side of the trail. She should have been afraid. A stranger, a mountain, a night with no moon to speak of. But the fear she'd carried into Black Ridge 3 days ago, the fear of being turned away again, of being laughed at again, of being nothing again. That fear had quieted, somehow replaced by something she didn't have words for yet. "Why'd you do it?" she asked into the dark. "Do what?" "Stand up. Back there. You didn't know me. Didn't owe me anything." She felt him go still in front of her just for a second. "Whitfield's dangerous. Everyone in that saloon knew it. Everyone except you, apparently." "I knew it." His voice had gone low, careful. "Better than most." "Then why?" He didn't answer right away, and Abigail thought maybe he wouldn't answer at all, that she'd pushed too far into something private. But then he spoke quiet, almost like he was working out the answer for himself as he said it. "I watched a lot of men stay quiet in my life," he said. "Watched it cost people everything. Told myself a long time ago I wasn't going to be one more man standing in a room doing nothing." He paused. "Guess I finally got tired of breaking that promise to myself." Abigail didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and they rode the rest of the way, in a silence that didn't feel empty. The cabin appeared suddenly out of the dark, a low shape tucked against a stand of pine smoke, long since gone cold from the chimney. Ashford swung down first, then reached up to help her, and she winced as her feet hit the ground, her ribs protesting the movement. "Easy." His hand stayed at her elbow a moment longer than necessary, steadying her. "You sure Whitfield didn't crack something?" "I'm sure." She wasn't entirely sure. "I've survived worse than a marshal's boot." Something flickered across his face, at that something that looked almost like anger, though it wasn't directed at her. Nobody should have to survive that even once. He led her inside, lit a lamp, and the small room flickered into view, sparse but clean. A rifle mounted above the hearth, a single chair pulled up to a wooden table covered in papers Abigail didn't have time to study before he swept them into a drawer. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the chair. "I'll get something for those ribs." "You don't have to fuss over me. I'm not fussing." He was already crossing to a shelf, pulling down a small tin and a clean cloth. "I'm making sure you don't drop dead in my cabin before you tell me what I need to know about your father." That at least got a tired laugh out of her. "Practical. Always have been." He worked in silence for a moment, pressing a damp cloth gently against the bruise forming along her jaw, and Abigail found herself studying his face up close for the first time. Really studying it, the scar through his eyebrow, the deep lines bracketing his mouth, the careful way his hands moved despite their size and roughness. "You're gentler than I expected," she said before she could stop herself. His hands paused. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. A man who draws on a marshal in front of 30 witnesses, I suppose I expected something rougher." She felt heat rise in her cheeks, grateful for the dim lamplight. "I didn't mean that as an insult. Didn't take it as one." He resumed his work voice, quieter now. "Most folks decide what kind of man I am before I open my mouth. Outlaw, killer, dangerous." He met her eyes briefly. "You're not wrong that I've done things. But there's a difference between being dangerous to a man like Whitfield and being dangerous to a woman who just got kicked across a saloon floor." Abigail held his gaze a moment longer than was comfortable, then looked away first. "Thank you. For tonight. For all of it. Don't thank me till you hear what I have to say." He set the cloth aside and pulled the second chair around, sitting across from her elbows on his knees, his full attention settling on her like a weight. "Tell me about your father. All of it. Don't leave anything out, even the parts that don't seem important." So she told him. She told him about her father, Thomas Harper, a quiet surveyor who'd spent years working for the Territorial Land Office before striking out on his own, chasing rumors of untouched timber deep in the high valleys north of Black Ridge. She told him about the letter he'd sent her 2 months before he died, full of excitement, full of plans talking about thousands of acres of hardwood. Nobody else had ever properly mapped. Land he intended to register and build a future. On a future he wanted to share with her. He said it would change everything for us. Abigail said, her voice catching. We didn't have much. My mother died when I was young, and it was just the two of us most of my life. He worked hard, but we never had enough to matter to anybody. This valley, he said it was going to be different. He said... She stopped, swallowed hard. He said for the first time in his life, he'd found something worth leaving behind. And then he was dead. The words came out flatter than she intended, worn smooth from 3 years of repeating them. They said his horse spooked on a mountain trail, said he fell, broke his neck. Happened 2 weeks after he registered the claim. She looked up at Ashford. 2 weeks, Mr. Ashford. After 30 years of careful surveying work without a single accident, he falls off a horse 2 weeks after filing on the most valuable land he'd ever found. You think it was murder. I know it was murder. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. I just can't prove it. By the time I got back to Black Ridge to settle his affairs, every document about that claim was gone. The land office had no record of it. The land itself had already been sold to the Coal Valley Lumber Company, sold by a deed bearing my father's signature, a signature I know he never wrote because I have 100 letters from him, and not one matches that forgery. Ashford had gone very still during this, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on something past her shoulder, somewhere in the middle distance. Coal Valley Lumber, he repeated. You know them. I know them better than I've told anyone in 5 years. He stood, abruptly crossed to the drawer where he'd hidden the papers earlier, and pulled it open. Abigail, I need you to understand something before I show you what I'm about to show you. Once you see this, there's no walking away from it. Whitfield already knows your face. If you're connected to me now, connected to what I've been working on, you're in danger that goes well beyond a boot to the ribs. I've been in danger for 3 years, she said. I just didn't know it had a name yet. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, like she'd passed some kind of test, and pulled a thick folder from the drawer, setting it on the table between them. 5 years ago, I wasn't an outlaw, he said. I was a federal tracker assigned to investigate corruption in territorial land offices, specifically claims involving timber rights across 3 counties. My partner was a man named Daniel Reyes. Good man. Better tracker than me, if I'm honest. He opened the folder, revealing pages of careful handwriting, names, dates, figures that meant nothing to Abigail yet, but clearly meant everything to him. We found a pattern. Surveyors who registered valuable timber claims kept dying in accidents. Land kept transferring to the same company within weeks of those deaths. Officials kept getting paid to look the other way. Coal Valley Lumber. Coal Valley Lumber, he confirmed. We were close, Abigail. 3 months from bringing it to a federal judge, evidence stacked high enough nobody could ignore it. His voice dropped rougher now. Daniel went to retrieve the last piece of evidence we needed. Found him 2 days later at the bottom of a ravine. Officially another accident. And unofficially I knew exactly who killed him, and I had no proof that would hold up. And the men who did it had enough money and enough friends in high places that pursuing it openly would have gotten me killed too. His hands, Abigail noticed, had curled into fists on the table. So I disappeared. Let people believe I'd gone bad, gone outlaw, easier to move through these mountains as a man nobody trusts with the law than as a federal investigator everybody's watching. Been collecting evidence ever since, piece by piece, waiting for enough to finally bring this whole rotten thing down. Abigail stared at this folder at 5 years of grief and patience laid out in careful handwriting. And my father. Your father might be the piece I've been missing. Ashford flipped through several pages until he found what he was looking for. A hand-drawn map of the High Valley, annotated with notes in 2 different handwritings. I found references to a new claim in this area about 3 years back, right before everything went quiet. Never could trace who filed it or what happened. If your father's claim is the one I think it is, and if there's any record left of the original registration anywhere, there has to be, Abigail interrupted, leaning forward despite the ache in her ribs. There has to be a copy somewhere. The territorial office keeps duplicates, doesn't it? Federal land offices always keep duplicates. They're supposed to. Something dark crossed his face. Convenient the fires that tend to happen in record rooms connected to Coal Valley Lumber's interests. A fire 2 years back. Whole east wing of the Territorial Archive in Helena burned down, officially blamed on a stove malfunction. He met her eyes. I never believed that for 1 minute. Abigail felt something cold settle in her stomach, a confirmation of every suspicion she'd carried for 3 years, twisted now into something even worse. So there's nothing left. No proof at all. Proof at none. I didn't say that. Ashford pulled out another page, this one a list of names. My partner Daniel kept a second set of notes separate from our official files, hidden somewhere outside the archive, specifically because he didn't trust how secure those records were. I never found where he hid them before he died. If your father's original survey documents still exist anywhere, my best guess is they'd be wherever Daniel hid his own evidence. And you have no idea where that is. I have ideas, none of them confirmed. He rubbed a hand over his face, the first sign of exhaustion she'd seen from him all night. There's an old chapel about 2 days' ride from here, abandoned mountain settlement. Nobody's lived there in 15 years. Daniel mentioned it once in passing, something about it being a good place to keep things safe from people who shouldn't find them. I never followed up, didn't think it mattered at the time. It matters now. It might? He closed the folder carefully. But Abigail, I need you to understand the risk here. If Whitfield knows your face, and he does now, he's already wondering why a federal outlaw stepped between you and his boot. By morning, word will reach the men who actually run this territory, and they will start asking the same question I'm asking myself right now. Which is whether the timing of your arrival and the resurfacing of an old buried case is coincidence, or whether somebody finally found a thread worth pulling. His winter sky eyes held hers steady. If it's the second one, they won't just send a marshal to handle this anymore. They'll send men who don't ask questions before they act. Abigail felt fear flicker through her, real fear different from the fear of being turned away or laughed at. This was the fear of a hunted animal, the fear her father must have felt in his final days without ever telling her, without ever warning her how dangerous his discovery truly was. But underneath the fear was something else, something that had been building in her chest since the moment Ashford rose from his chair in that saloon. 3 years of doors closing. 3 years of being told to give up, to accept that her father's death meant nothing, that his legacy was simply gone, swallowed by men too powerful to question. And now finally, somebody believed her. Somebody with the knowledge, the experience, the same enemy sitting across the table looking at her like her fight and his fight had become the same fight. I'm not stopping now, she said. I've spent 3 years being told this doesn't matter, that I don't matter enough to chase it. I'd rather face whatever they send than spend one more day pretending my father's death was an accident. Something shifted in Ashford's expression. Respect maybe, or recognition of a determination that matched his own. All right then. He stood moving to bank the fire for the night. We rest tonight. At first light we start for that chapel. 2 days' ride, rough terrain most of the way. You don't have to come with me. I know I don't have to. He glanced back at her firelight, catching the hard line of his jaw. I'm choosing to. Daniel's been dead 5 years, and I've done nothing but collect papers in drawers since then, too careful, too patient, telling myself I was waiting for the right moment. He paused. Watching you stand back up off that saloon floor tonight, still fighting after 3 years of nobody listening, that felt like the moment I've been waiting for. Abigail didn't trust herself to speak, so she only nodded, throat tight. He showed her to the small second room, little more than a cot and a folded blanket. And as he turned to leave, she caught his sleeve. Cole. It was the first time she'd used his given name. Thank you. For believing me when nobody else would. Something softened in his expression just slightly, the hard angles of his face easing for a moment in the lamplight. Get some rest, Abigail. Tomorrow's going to test both of us. He left her there, and Abigail lay down on the narrow cot, every part of her body aching, her mind racing through everything she'd learned. A murdered partner, a burned archive, a hidden chapel that might hold the only surviving proof of her father's claim and her father's murder. Sleep came slowly, fitful, full of dreams of fire and falling, and somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, she woke to the sound of voices outside the cabin, low and urgent. She crept to the window, careful of her ribs, and saw Cole standing in the moonlight with another man she didn't recognize. An older man with gray in his beard and worry etched deep into his face. "They know," the older man was saying, voice tight with fear. "Whitfield sent a rider to Helena tonight. Word's already moving." "How fast?" "Fast as a horse can carry it. Cole, if they connect you to the girl, if they realize what you've been sitting on all these years. I know what happens." Cole's voice had gone hard dangerous in a way Abigail hadn't heard from him yet. "Get word to anyone you trust. Tell them to watch the roads. If men start moving toward Black Ridge that don't belong here, I need to know before they arrive, not after." The older man nodded, swung up onto a waiting horse, and disappeared into the dark trees. Cole stood alone for a long moment afterward, staring up at the cold stars, and Abigail watched him from the window, watched the weight settle visibly onto his shoulders, the weight of 5 years finally coming due. She returned to her cot before he could catch her watching, but sleep didn't find her again that night. She lay awake instead, thinking about her father's letter, about the excitement in his handwriting, about a future he never got to build. Thinking about a man named Daniel Reyes, dead at the bottom of a ravine for getting too close to the same truth she was chasing. Thinking about Cole Ashford, who'd spent 5 years as an outlaw, rather than abandon a promise to a dead friend. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold over the mountains, Abigail rose dressed, and found Cole already outside saddling 2 horses, his face set with the particular calm of a man who'd made peace with whatever the day might bring. "You heard, didn't you?" he said without turning around. "Last night." "I heard enough. Then you understand what we're riding into." He finished cinching the saddle and turned to face her fully. "Last chance to walk away clean, Abigail. I can get you somewhere safe, somewhere far from all this, and you'd never have to risk what's coming." "My father risked everything for that land," she said. "I'm not walking away now." Something fierce and proud flickered across his face. Gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the steady, careful expression she was coming to recognize as simply who he was. "Then let's ride. 2 days to the chapel, and Whitfield's men are already moving. We don't have time to waste." He helped her onto her horse, the movement gentler than it needed to be, his hand lingering at her waist a half-second longer than necessary, before he stepped back, swung onto his own horse, and led the way out of the clearing. They rode hard through the morning, climbing higher into terrain Abigail had never seen. Switchback trails cut into rock faces, narrow passes between towering pines, the air growing thinner and colder with every mile. Cole rode just ahead of her, watching the trail with the focused intensity of a man who'd survived in these mountains precisely because he never stopped watching, and Abigail found herself studying him as they rode this strange, careful, dangerous man who'd upended her entire understanding of what kindness could look like. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses beside a narrow creek, and Cole produced dried meat and hard bread from his saddlebags, splitting it evenly between them without comment. "Can I ask you something?" Abigail said, chewing slowly, her appetite still dulled by the ache in her ribs. "Go ahead. 5 years alone in these mountains, hunted, hiding, waiting for a chance to finish what you started. Why didn't you give up? Most men would have." She watched his face carefully. "I almost gave up more than once. 3 years of doors closing, and there were nights I thought about just letting it go, accepting the land was lost, and trying to build some kind of life anyway." Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring into the creek water rushing past them. "Daniel had a wife," he finally said. "Sarah. Sweet woman, sharper than both of us combined. She used to tell me Daniel believed the law existed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, and that the day men like us stopped believing, that was the day the law stopped meaning anything at all." His jaw tightened. "After he died, I went to tell her myself. Couldn't stomach letting some official deliver that news in a form letter." He paused. "She didn't cry. Not in front of me. She just asked me one question. Asked if I was going to finish what they started. 'What did you tell her?' Told her yes." His eyes met Abigail's. "Been trying to keep that promise every day since even on the days I wasn't sure I still believed I could." "Do you believe it now?" Something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like hope, fragile and unfamiliar on a face that had clearly spent years guarding against exactly that feeling. Sitting here with you knowing your father's claim might be the thread that unravels all of it. Yeah, I believe it now. They rode on through the afternoon, the trail growing rougher, narrower, climbing along ridges where one wrong step would send horse and rider tumbling into the valley below. Abigail's ribs ached with every jolt, but she said nothing, gritting her teeth and focusing on the rhythm of the horse beneath her, on the solid presence of Cole riding just ahead. It was near dusk when Cole suddenly reined his horse to a stop, one hand raised for silence. "What is it?" Abigail whispered. "Smoke." He pointed toward a thin gray line rising above the tree line ahead of them, barely visible against the darkening sky. "Campfire. Could be hunters." His voice dropped lower. "Could be men looking for us." "How do we know which?" "We don't. Not yet." He swung down from his horse, moving with a hunter's silence, despite his size, and gestured for her to do the same. "Stay close. Stay quiet. If I tell you to run, you run, and you don't look back to see what's happening behind you." Abigail's heart hammered against her bruised ribs as they crept forward through the trees, Cole's hand occasionally finding her arm to guide her around fallen branches that might snap underfoot. The smoke grew closer, and with it came the murmur of voices, low and rough. 3 or 4 men by the sound of it. Cole eased them behind a fallen log at the edge of a small clearing, and Abigail peered carefully over the top, her breath catching at what she saw. 4 men sat around a small fire rifles, leaning against their saddles, and even in the dim light, Abigail recognized one of them immediately. The same cowhand who'd stood by the saloon door the night before, who'd looked away rather than help her, was now sitting with 3 strangers she'd never seen, men with the hard, watchful look of hired guns rather than working cowboys. "Said she's traveling with him now," one of the strangers was saying. "Whitfield wants them both found before they reach wherever they're heading." "Ashford's no fool," the cowhand replied, voice tight with nerves. "Man survived 5 years out here alone. Won't be easy to track him if he doesn't want tracking." "Don't have to track him forever," the first stranger said, spitting into the fire. "Just have to be faster than him to wherever he's going, and we got information he doesn't have." Abigail felt Cole go rigid beside her. "What information?" the second stranger asked. "Whitfield's men searched the girl's room before she left town. Found a letter. Old one from her daddy talking about hiding something important up near some old chapel if things ever went wrong." The man laughed low and ugly. "Looks like Ashford's about to lead us straight to whatever he's been hunting for 5 years. Cole's hand found Abigail's arm in the darkness, gripping tight, and she understood without words what he was thinking. The letter. Her father's last letter. The one she'd kept folded in her satchel for 3 years. The one that mentioned the chapel only in passing words she'd never fully understood until last night. They knew where she was leading him. They might already be there waiting. Cole pulled her back from the log without a sound, his hand still locked around her arm, and didn't let go until they'd put 30 yards of dark trees between themselves and that fire. "They have it," Abigail whispered, her voice shaking. "The letter. Whitfield's men took it from my room." "I heard." Cole's jaw was tight as iron. "Means they know about the chapel before we've even gotten close to it. How my father only mentioned it once in passing. Once is all it takes when somebody's looking hard enough." He glanced back toward the firelight glowing faint through the trees. "Question now is whether they beat us there, or whether we still got a head start. What do? We don't take the main trail." Already he was moving, leading her back toward the horses tied a 1/4 mile down the slope. "There's a longer route, rougher, goes around the ridge instead of through the pass. Those men are camped near. Adds half a day, maybe more, but it keeps us clear of them. Half a day we might not have. Better than walking straight into 4 armed men." He swung up into his saddle, reaching down to help her up behind him. "Hold tight, we're riding through the night." The darkness swallowed them as they pushed deeper into the mountains, the trail barely visible even to Cole's practiced eye branches, snagging at Abigail's skirts, the cold biting through her coat. She held on, ribs aching with every jolt, and tried not to think about four men around a campfire discussing how easily they'd track a federal outlaw and a kicked-down woman straight to the one piece of evidence that could end them all. They rode until the horses were lathered and stumbling with exhaustion, finally stopping in a narrow hollow just as gray light began creeping over the eastern ridges. Cole dismounted, first scanning the trees with the same careful intensity he'd shown at the fire. "We rest an hour," he said. "No more. Horses need it, and so do you, whether you'll admit it or not." "I'm fine. You're gray as a ghost, and you've been holding your ribs since we stopped." He helped her down anyway, his hands steady, despite his own obvious exhaustion. "Sit. Eat something. I'll keep watch." Abigail sank down against a boulder, grateful despite herself, and watched Cole pace the perimeter of their small camp rifle in hand, eyes never still. There was something almost beautiful in how completely he'd given himself over to protecting her, a stranger he'd known less than a full day, and she found herself wondering what kind of man he might have been if Daniel Reyes had never died in that ravine, if 5 years of grief and hiding hadn't hardened him into whatever he'd become, Cole. She waited until he glanced her way. "If something happens to me out here, if those men catch us before we reach the chapel, I need you to promise me something." "Nothing's happening to you." "Promise me anyway." Her voice was steady, despite the fear underneath it. "If I can't finish this, you will. My father didn't die for nothing, and neither will I." Something flickered across his face, raw and unguarded, for just a moment, before he caught it and smoothed it away. "Nobody's dying out here, Abigail. Not you. Not today." He crouched down in front of her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. "I already failed to protect Daniel. I'm not failing twice." They pushed on within the hour, the trail growing rougher as Cole had promised narrow switchbacks along exposed rock faces that made Abigail's stomach clench with every careful step the horses took. By midday, the chapel came into view below them, a weathered structure of gray stone and rotting timber nestled in a small clearing, abandoned and silent, exactly as Cole had described. But they weren't the first ones there. Cole reined his horse to a sudden stop at the tree line, one hand raised in warning, and Abigail's heart sank as she followed his gaze down toward the clearing. 5 horses stood tethered near the chapel's entrance. Men moved around the structure, rifles in hand, and even from this distance, Abigail recognized the broad shoulders and familiar swagger of Marshal Whitfield himself. "They beat us here," she breathed. "Not all the way." Cole's eyes were scanning the scene with cold precision. "They're searching, not finding. Means whatever your father hid, it's not sitting out in the open waiting to be found." "How do you know that?" "Because Whitfield's still here instead of riding back to celebrate." He swung down from his horse, motioning for her to do the same, and led them both deeper into the cover of the trees, circling wide around the clearing. "Your father was careful enough to hide a federal land claim from a powerful lumber company for 3 years. He wouldn't have left whatever proof exists somewhere a man could find in an afternoon of searching." They crept closer through the trees, staying low until they had a clear view of the chapel's far side, partially hidden from where Whitfield's men were concentrated. Abigail counted 6 men total, now more than she'd expected, all armed, all moving with the methodical patience of men, confident they had time on their side. "There," Cole whispered, pointing toward a narrow gap in the chapel's stone foundation, half hidden behind a collapsed section of wall. "Old root cellar, probably. Storage space beneath the floor. You think that's where he hid it?" "I think it's worth checking before we do anything else." His eyes were already calculating distance, cover the position of every armed man in the clearing. "Problem is getting you there without 6 rifles turning your way before we even reach the door. What if you draw them away?" Cole's head snapped toward her. "Absolutely not." "You said it yourself, Cole. They're searching for something specific, something they think is hidden inside. If you give them a reason to focus everything on you instead, even for a few minutes—" "I'm not using you as a distraction while I create one." His voice had gone hard, almost angry. "That's not how this works. It's not what I'm asking." Abigail met his eyes steadily, despite the fear hammering in her chest. "I'm asking you to trust that I can move quietly enough to reach that cellar, while 6 armed men are focused on whatever you do to pull their attention. You've survived in these mountains for 5 years being underestimated by men who think they know exactly what you are. Let them underestimate you one more time." For a long moment, Cole said nothing, his jaw working as he weighed the risk. The same calculation Abigail could see playing out behind his eyes that had likely played out 100 times in the 5 years he'd spent surviving as a hunted man. "If this goes wrong," he finally said, "you run. Doesn't matter what's happening to me. You run and you don't look back." "Cole, promise me." His hand found her shoulder gripping tight. "Same as you asked me to promise you. I need to hear you say it." "I promise," she said, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. He nodded once, and without another word rose from their cover and walked directly toward the clearing, hand's raised voice, carrying clear and steady across the open ground. "Whitfield!" Every rifle in the clearing swung toward him at once. "Ashford!" Whitfield's voice carried surprise, then something darker, more satisfied. "Wondered how long before you showed your face." "You've got 6 guns on one man," Cole said, still walking forward slow and deliberate. "Hardly seems fair odds for a marshal who claims to uphold the law." "Law's whatever I say it is out here." Whitfield's hand drifted toward his holster, though he didn't draw. "Where's the girl, Ashford? Don't tell me you left her wandering these mountains alone." "She's safe," Cole said, and Abigail, watching from the trees, felt her stomach twist at the lie. "Somewhere you'll never find her. This is between you and me now." "Is it?" Whitfield's eyes narrowed. Funny thing, a federal investigator playing outlaw for 5 years suddenly real interested in some dead surveyor's daughter and her daddy's land claim. "You think I'm stupid, Ashford? You think Coal Valley hasn't been watching every move you've made since Daniel Reyes took that fall?" Something dangerous flickered across Cole's face at his partner's name. "Daniel didn't fall. We both know that." "Maybe he didn't." Whitfield's smile was cold. "Maybe he should have minded his own business, same as you should be minding yours right now." While every eye in the clearing remained fixed on the confrontation unfolding between Cole and Whitfield, Abigail moved. She kept low, hugging the tree line, her heart pounding so loud she was certain someone would hear it over the tense exchange happening near the chapel's front entrance. The gap in the foundation grew closer with each careful step, and she forced herself to breathe slow, to move slower. Every instinct screaming at her to run, while every ounce of discipline she possessed kept her measured and quiet. Behind her, Whitfield's voice carried sharp through the clearing. "You really think one man can stop what's already in motion? Coal Valley's bigger than you, bigger than Daniel ever understood. You expose us. You think it stops the company. Somebody else just steps into our place and the same thing keeps happening." "Maybe," Cole said. "Or maybe enough people finally see what's been happening right under their noses, and that's enough to start changing things." Abigail reached the gap in the foundation and dropped to her knees, pulling aside loose stones with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The space beneath revealed itself slowly, a narrow crawl space leading into darkness beneath the chapel floor. And she forced herself forward into it, despite every nerve screaming against the tight, suffocating dark. Her hands found earth, then wood, then the unmistakable edge of something deliberately placed, hidden, protected. A box. She pulled it free with trembling hands, her fingers finding a small brass latch corroded with age, but still intact, and inside, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect against moisture, she found it. A leather-bound survey journal, federal seal stamped into its cover. Her father's careful handwriting visible the moment she opened the first page. Tears blurred her vision as she flipped through pages of boundary maps, witness signatures, official registration stamps. Everything Cole had said they needed, everything that proved beyond any doubt that Thomas Harper had legally claimed this land years before Coal Valley Lumber had stolen it through forgery and murder. But as she pulled the journal free, she heard a voice behind her. "Well now, look what we got hiding in the dirt." Abigail's spun journal clutched against her chest to find one of Whitfield's men standing at the entrance to the crawlspace, rifle already raised. "Found her," the man called out loud enough to carry across the clearing. "Found her, and whatever she dug up." Everything happened at once. Cole moved before Whitfield could react, closing the distance between them in 2 strides, his fist connecting with the marshal's jaw, hard enough to drop him to the ground. The clearing erupted into chaos, men shouting, rifles swinging in every direction, and Abigail scrambled backward out of the crawl space, just as the man who'd found her grabbed for her arm. She twisted away, journal still clutched tight, and felt fabric tear as she pulled free, stumbling toward the chapel's interior through a gap in the rotting door. "Get her!" Whitfield's voice roared from somewhere behind her, thick with fury and pain. "Don't let her get away with that journal!" Abigail pressed herself against the cold stone wall inside the chapel chest. Heaving journal clutched against her like a shield, and through a crack in the boards, she watched chaos unfold outside. Cole had drawn his revolver, now not firing, but holding it level, his back against the chapel's outer wall, putting himself between the armed men and the door where Abigail had disappeared. "Anybody comes through that door?" Cole said, voice carrying low and dangerous across the clearing. "They're gonna have to go through me first." "There's 6 of us, and one of you, Ashford." Whitfield spat blood trickling from his split lip. "You really think that revolver's gonna save you? Don't need it to save me." Cole's eyes were steady, almost calm despite 6 rifles trained on him. "Just need it to buy enough time." "Time for what?" As if summoned by the question itself, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the clearing. Multiple riders coming fast along the trail Abigail and Cole had taken that morning. Whitfield's head turned sharply toward the sound, confusion flickering across his face. What in hell? The first rider broke through the tree line, and Abigail, peering through the gap in the boards, felt her breath catch at the sight of a familiar face. The blacksmith from Black Ridge, a heavy-set man she'd seen working at his forge the day she'd arrived in town, now mounted on a horse with a rifle of his own slung across his back. Behind him came more riders. The schoolteacher, a thin woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun. The hotel owner who'd refused Abigail a room 3 nights ago. Old ranchers Abigail didn't recognize by name, but whose weathered faces spoke of decades working this hard country. And riding at the front of them all was the older man Abigail had seen speaking with Cole in the darkness outside his cabin, the one who'd warned him that word was already moving toward Helena. "That's enough, Whitfield," the older man called out, reining his horse to a stop at the edge of the clearing, a dozen armed townspeople fanning out behind him. 5 years we've all stayed quiet while you and Cole Valley did whatever you pleased in this territory. 5 years too many." Whitfield's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence crumbling visibly. "Garrett, you don't understand what you're interfering with." "I understand plenty." Garrett's voice carried hard across the clearing. "Understand a man's been kicking a defenseless woman across saloon floors and burning federal records and killing surveyors who get too close to the truth. Understand, we've all been too scared to say a word about any of it until now." "This isn't your fight," Whitfield snarled, but his hand had finally dropped away from his holster entirely, the math of the situation clearly shifting in front of him. "It became our fight the moment you started murdering folks for the crime of finding honest land," the schoolteacher said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the rifle she held with obvious unfamiliarity. "I taught half the children in this valley. Taught Thomas Harper's daughter her letters, if I recall correctly, years back before her mother passed." Abigail, still hidden inside the chapel, felt tears spring fresh to her eyes at those words, at the realization that even now, even after everything, somebody in Black Ridge remembered her father as more than just a name on a stolen deed. Cole used the distraction to his advantage, moving fast, disarming the nearest of Whitfield's men with brutal efficiency before the man even registered the threat. The clearing dissolved into a tense standoff, rifles raised on both sides now, but the numbers had shifted dramatically, and every one of Whitfield's hired men seemed to understand it. "Drop your weapons," Cole said, his revolver now leveled directly at Whitfield. "This ends now, one way or another." Whitfield's eyes darted between the armed townspeople surrounding him, and Cole's steady aim calculating odds that had collapsed entirely against him in the span of a few minutes. "You think this changes anything?" Whitfield said, but his voice had lost its earlier menace, replaced by something closer to desperation. "Cole Valley's got judges in their pocket, got officials clear up to the territorial governor's office. You expose this, they'll bury you just like they buried Reyes." "Maybe they will," Cole said. Or maybe enough good people finally standing together is exactly what stops men like you from getting away with murder. It was in that moment, with rifles still raised and the air thick with tension that could break into violence at any second, that Whitfield's eyes found something past Cole's shoulder, something that made his expression shift from desperation to something almost like triumph. "Burn it!" he shouted suddenly, voice cracking with urgency. "The journal. Whatever she found, burn it now, before any of this matters." Abigail's blood ran cold as she realized one of Whitfield's men, the one who'd discovered her at the crawlspace entrance, had circled around toward the chapel's far side. A lit torch already in hand, flames licking hungrily at the dry, rotting wood of the old structure. "No!" Abigail's voice tore from her throat before she could stop it, and she burst from her hiding place inside the chapel. Journal clutched desperately against her chest, just as fire began catching along the chapel's outer wall. Cole's head snapped toward her voice, toward the flames now spreading rapidly along old dry timber. And for one terrible moment, Abigail watched something break open across his face. Raw fear, unlike anything she'd seen from him since they'd met. "Abigail, get clear of that building." She was already moving, stumbling through smoke, beginning to fill the chapel's interior. Journal still gripped tight against her chest. Every step feeling impossibly slow as flames crackled louder behind her, consuming decades-old wood with terrifying speed. The doorway loomed ahead, smoke thick enough now that her eyes streamed and her lungs burned, and just as she felt the heat at her back growing unbearable, strong hands caught her, pulling her free of the doorway and clear of the flames entirely. Cole's arms wrapped around her, pulling her several yards back from the burning chapel, before either of them collapsed to the ground together. Abigail coughing smoke from her lungs, the journal still somehow impossibly clutched safe against her chest. "You're all right," Cole said, his voice rough, his hands moving over her shoulders, her arms checking for injury with an urgency that spoke of fear barely contained. "You're all right. You're safe. I've got you." "The journal," Abigail managed between coughs. "I got it, Cole. I got it out." Behind them, the chapel continued to burn flames, now consuming the entire structure, decades of abandonment finally giving way to fire that no one moved to stop. But the journal in Abigail's hands remained untouched, smoke-stained at the edges but whole, its pages of federal seals and survey maps and her father's careful handwriting still perfectly legible. Whitfield stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, surrounded now by armed townspeople who'd watched everything unfold, watched a man order a building burned with 2 people still potentially inside it, watched the full ugly truth of what he was capable of, laid bare in front of witnesses, who could no longer pretend not to see it. "It's over, Whitfield," Garrett said, his voice carrying grim finality across the clearing. "Every person here just watched you try to burn evidence and risk 2 lives doing it. There's no talking your way out of this one." Whitfield's shoulders sagged, the last of his bravado, finally collapsing entirely, and for the first time since Abigail had encountered him in that saloon, he looked less like a dangerous man and more like exactly what he was underneath the badge and the cruelty, a frightened man who'd finally run out of power to hide behind. Cole helped Abigail to her feet, his hand lingering at her waist, his eyes still searching her face for any sign of injury from the smoke and flame. "You ever do something that reckless again?" he said, voice rough with emotion. He was clearly fighting to control. "I swear to God, Abigail Harper." "I got the journal," she said again, holding it up between them, smoke-stained but intact. "We have it, Cole. We actually have it." Something broke loose in his expression. Then relief and fear, and something else entirely tangled together. And for a moment, standing in the smoke and chaos with armed townspeople surrounding a defeated marshal and a chapel burning to ash behind them, Abigail felt the full weight of 3 years finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. But even as Garrett and the others moved to secure Whitfield, even as the immediate danger finally began to settle, Cole's eyes lifted toward the trail leading back down toward Black Ridge, and his expression hardened with new urgency. "This isn't finished," he said quietly, just for her. "Whitfield's caught, but the men who actually run Coal Valley Lumber are still out there, still untouched, still powerful enough to make this entire moment disappear if we don't move fast enough to make it matter." "What do we do now?" "Now," Cole said, helping her toward the waiting horses. We make sure every person in this territory hears the truth before Coal Valley finds a way to bury it one more time." They rode back into Black Ridge as the sun dropped low over the western peaks. Whitfield bound and silent on his own horse, surrounded by the same townspeople who'd once looked away while he kicked a defenseless woman across a saloon floor. Word had already traveled ahead of them somehow, the way word always did in small towns. And by the time they reached the main street, people stood in doorways and windows watching the strange procession pass. "They're staring," Abigail said quietly, riding beside Cole now instead of behind him, the journal wrapped carefully in cloth and tucked against her chest. "Let them stare." Cole's eyes scanned the street with the same wary alertness he'd carried since the chapel. Better they see this than hear some twisted version of it from Coal Valley's people first. Garrett rode up alongside them, his weathered face creased with concern. "I sent word ahead before we left the chapel. There's a federal circuit judge making rounds through the territory was supposed to pass within 2 days of here, handling some minor land disputes. If we can reach him before Coal Valley's people in Helena hear what happened." "They'll already know," Cole said grimly. "Word travels both directions. Question is whether the judge arrives before they manage to bury this under enough money and influence to make it disappear." "Judge Calloway's no friend to Coal Valley," Garrett said. "Man's got a reputation for being stubborn as a mule and twice as hard to bribe. If anyone can move fast enough to matter, it's him." They secured Whitfield in the town's small jailhouse. Though Abigail noticed the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same building where Whitfield himself had likely thrown countless men for crimes far smaller than his own. As evening settled over Black Ridge, the saloon that had witnessed her humiliation 3 nights ago now filled instead with townspeople gathering to hear the full truth drawn by whispers and rumors that had already begun spreading faster than anyone could control. Cole stood at the front of the room, Abigail beside him, the journal open on the bar for anyone who wished to examine it themselves. 5 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clear across the crowded room. "I was a federal investigator assigned to look into corruption involving timber claims across this territory. My partner and I found evidence that Coal Valley Lumber had been systematically stealing land from surveyors and settlers, forging documents, bribing officials, and, when necessary, murdering anyone who got too close to proving it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some faces showing shock, others showing something closer to grim confirmation of suspicions long held but never voiced. "My partner Daniel Reyes died investigating this conspiracy," Cole continued. "Official report called it an accident. I knew better, but I had no proof strong enough to stop men with that much money and that much reach. So I disappeared. Let everyone believe I'd gone outlaw because moving through these mountains as a wanted man gave me more freedom to keep digging than staying a federal agent ever would have. And the girl," someone called from the back of the room. "What's she got to do with any of this?" "Her father." Thomas Harper discovered the same valley Coal Valley's been quietly stripping for timber these past 3 years, Cole said. He registered the claim legally properly exactly as the law requires. 2 weeks later he was dead, and his land had been transferred to Coal Valley through a forged signature. Abigail stepped forward, her voice steadier than she'd expected it to be, given how violently her heart was pounding. "I spent 3 years trying to get anyone, any lawyer, any official to even look at my father's original deed. Every door closed in my face. Every person told me the land was already settled, already sold, nothing left to discuss." Her eyes swept the room, finding faces she recognized from her arrival 3 days ago, faces that had watched her humiliation without moving. "I came to this town 4 days ago, believing the marshal might finally listen to reason. Instead, he kicked me to the floor of this very saloon in front of every one of you." Silence fell heavy across the room, several people shifting uncomfortably, unable to meet her eyes. "Not one person moved to help me that night." Abigail continued, and though her voice carried no anger, the weight of the words seemed to land harder for it. "I understand why. I understand fear, understand what it costs to stand against men who hold power over your livelihood, your safety, everything you've built here. But I need you to understand something too." She lifted the journal, holding it high enough for the lamplight to catch the federal seals stamped into its cover. "This is proof. Proof my father told the truth. proof he was murdered for finding it. And the only reason it exists today, the only reason I'm standing here instead of having given up 3 years ago, is because one man refused to stay silent when everyone else chose fear instead. She looked at Cole. Then, and something passed between them that needed no words. Gratitude and recognition, and something else entirely that Abigail wasn't ready to name, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. The saloon doors swung open before anyone could respond, and a thin man in a dust-covered traveling coat stepped through, flanked by 2 deputies Abigail didn't recognize. His sharp eyes swept the room with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to walking into volatile situations. "I understand there's been some excitement in Black Ridge," the man said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone used to commanding attention without raising his volume. "Garrett's rider found me on the Helena Road. I'm Judge Calloway. Somebody want to explain why I'm hearing about murdered surveyors, burned chapels, and a federal agent who's apparently been living as an outlaw for 5 years?" Cole stepped forward immediately. Something in his posture shifting the careful caution of a hunted man, giving way to something closer to the bearing he must have carried before everything fell apart 5 years ago. "Judge Calloway, my name is Cole Ashford. I was assigned to the territorial corruption investigation under Marshal Daniel Reyes's supervision before his death 5 years ago." Calloway's eyes narrowed sharply. "Ashford. I remember that name. Investigation went cold after Reyes died. Word came down that the whole case had been closed, evidence insufficient to proceed. Word came down from people with every reason to want that investigation closed," Cole said. "I have 5 years of evidence proving exactly why. And now I have this woman's father's original survey journal federal seals, and all proving Coal Valley Lumber forged a land transfer after murdering the rightful owner." Calloway's expression sharpened with genuine interest, now the board authority of a circuit judge handling routine disputes, giving way to something far more alert. "Show me." Abigail stepped forward, hands trembling slightly as she handed over the journal her father had hidden with his life on the line, the same journal she'd nearly died, retrieving from a burning chapel only hours earlier. Calloway took it with careful reverence, examining each page methodically, his weathered face revealing nothing as he worked through boundary maps, witness signatures, official registration stamps that predated Coal Valley's claimed ownership by months. "This is genuine," Calloway finally said, looking up with something like grim satisfaction. "Federal registration seal properly dated, properly witnessed. If this matches territorial records—" "Territorial records were destroyed," Cole interrupted. "Helena Archive fire 2 years back. Officially ruled accidental." "Conveniently accidental," Calloway muttered, his jaw tightening. "I remember that fire. Always seemed strange how thoroughly it consumed exactly the records pertaining to certain timber disputes." He closed the journal carefully. "This changes things considerably, Mr. Ashford. If you have 5 years of evidence connecting Coal Valley to a pattern of forged transfers and murdered claimants, and now physical proof in the form of an original federal registration that survived their attempt at destruction, we have more than enough grounds for a formal hearing." When Abigail asked, unable to keep the urgency from her voice. "Tomorrow morning," Calloway said. "I won't give Coal Valley time to mount whatever defense money can buy. We hold this hearing here in Black Ridge with whatever witnesses can be gathered tonight." His eyes swept the crowded saloon. "Seems like there's no shortage of people in this room with something to say, if they're finally willing to say it." A long silence followed the weight of the judge's words settling over the room. Abigail watched faces shift, some still fearful, others showing the first signs of something breaking loose after years of forced silence. It was the blacksmith who spoke first, the same heavy-set man who'd ridden to the chapel with a rifle slung across his back. "I'll testify," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Coal Valley's been forcing settlers off land for years, using forged paper and false debts. I've seen it happen to 3 families myself, watched them ride out of this valley with nothing because nobody would believe their word against a company with judges in their pocket. As will I," the schoolteacher added, rising from her seat near the back. "I've watched children pulled from my classroom because their families lost everything to claims they couldn't fight. I should have spoken years ago. I was afraid. I'm not afraid anymore." One by one, voices rose across the saloon townspeople who'd watched silently for years, finally finding courage in the presence of a federal judge and a journal that proved the truth couldn't be buried forever. The hotel owner spoke of guests who'd arrived seeking land disputes and disappeared before ever reaching a courtroom. Old ranchers spoke of neighbors who'd vanished overnight, their land suddenly transferred to Coal Valley, through paperwork nobody had witnessed them signing. Calloway listened to each account, his expression growing harder with every testimony, until finally he raised a hand for silence. "I've heard enough tonight to know this hearing tomorrow needs to happen properly with full record being kept." His eyes found Cole again. "Mr. Ashford, I'll need your complete evidence file, everything you've gathered these past 5 years. And I'll need you both." His gaze shifted to include Abigail, prepared to testify formally under oath with full understanding that Coal Valley will send their own lawyers the moment word reaches them tonight. "We'll be ready," Cole said. "Good." Calloway closed the journal with finality. "Then I suggest everyone get what rest they can tonight. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and I have a feeling Coal Valley isn't going to surrender this fight without considerable effort to make it disappear first." The crowd began dispersing slowly, voices buzzing with the kind of nervous energy that came from years of suppressed truth, finally breaking free. Abigail found herself standing near the bar with Cole, both of them suddenly aware of how exhausted they truly were. The events of the past 2 days, finally catching up to bodies and minds that had been running on adrenaline alone. "You did that," Cole said quietly, watching the room empty around them. "Got an entire town to finally find their voice. 5 years I've been trying to do exactly that, and you managed it in one night." "I didn't do it alone," Abigail said. "You're the one who's been carrying this fight for 5 years, who never gave up, even when everyone who mattered told you it was already lost." "Maybe." He studied her for a long moment, something unguarded in his expression that she hadn't seen before, not even in their most private conversations. "But I think I needed someone to remind me why the fight still mattered. Been so focused on collecting evidence, on building a case nobody would ever see, that I forgot what it actually looked like to stand up for somebody right in front of me instead of fighting for justice in the abstract." Before Abigail could respond, Garrett approached, his weathered face creased with new concern. "Cole, word just came in. Ryder passed through an hour ago, said 3 men left Helena before sundown riding hard toward Black Ridge. Men matching descriptions of Coal Valley's enforcement crew." Cole's expression hardened instantly. "How far out?" "Maybe 4 hours if they push their horses. They're coming to silence witnesses before the hearing," Cole said grimly. "Or to make sure that journal disappears one more time permanently this time." "Calloway's got deputies," Garrett said. 2 men, but armed and capable. 2 men against whatever Coal Valley's sending won't be enough." Cole's jaw tightened with the calculation Abigail had come to recognize the same careful assessment he'd shown at the chapel before deciding to walk directly into 6 armed men. "We need to secure that journal somewhere they can't reach it, and we need eyes watching every road into town tonight." "I'll spread word," Garrett said. "Half the men who rode to that chapel today still have their rifles. Won't take much convincing to get them watching the roads tonight, not after everything they just heard." As Garrett hurried off to organize the town's defense, Cole turned back to Abigail, his expression softening slightly, even through the obvious tension. "You should rest," he said. "Whatever happens tonight, tomorrow, you'll need to testify clearly, steadily, without exhaustion clouding your words." "How am I supposed to rest knowing men are riding here right now to silence everyone who spoke tonight?" "You rest because I'm not leaving your side tonight," Cole said simply. "Whatever comes through that door, they'll have to go through me first to reach you." Something in his tone left no room for argument, and Abigail found herself believing him completely the same way she'd believed him in the saloon 4 nights ago, when he'd risen from the shadows to stop a marshal's boot from finding her ribs again. They took rooms at the same small hotel where Abigail had been refused service days earlier, though the hotel owner now offered both rooms without hesitation, his earlier cruelty replaced by something closer to shame. Cole insisted on the room adjoining hers, rifle within reach, sleep clearly the furthest thing from his mind, despite his obvious exhaustion. Abigail lay awake in the darkness, every sound from the street below, sending fresh spikes of fear through her chest until finally unable to bear the silence and her own racing thoughts any longer, she rose and knocked softly on the connecting door. Cole opened it immediately, rifle in hand, clearly not having slept at all. "Can't sleep either," she said somewhat unnecessarily given the evidence in front of her. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. "Better than both of us lying awake separately, jumping at every sound." She settled into the single chair near the window, while Cole resumed his post nearby, eyes fixed on the dark street below. For a long while, neither spoke, the silence comfortable, despite the danger pressing in from every direction. "Can I ask you something?" Abigail finally said. "You keep asking me that. Just ask. 5 years alone hunted hiding. Did you ever think about giving up? Finding somewhere far from all this, building some kind of quiet life instead?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, his eyes still on the street. "Every single day," he finally admitted. "There were nights I'd lie awake calculating how far I could ride before anyone found me. What name I might take, what kind of life a man could build when he stopped fighting battles that weren't his to win alone." He glanced at her. "But then, I'd think about Daniel, about Sarah's face when she asked if I'd finish what we started, and giving up felt like it would kill something in me worse than any bullet Coal Valley could put in my back." "I understand that," Abigail said softly. "There were nights these past 3 years I thought about exactly the same thing. Finding some town far from Black Ridge, some life where nobody knew my father's name, or what happened to his land, where I could just exist without constantly fighting to be believed." "What stopped you?" "My father's letter," she said. "The one he sent before he died, talking about how excited he was, how this valley was going to change everything for us. I couldn't let that excitement, that hope just disappear because the truth was inconvenient for powerful men." She met Cole's eyes in the dim light. "I think that's why I understood you the moment you stood up in that saloon. We were both fighting the same fight, just from different directions, both of us too stubborn to let go, even when everyone told us we should." Cole's expression shifted, something tender, breaking through the careful guard he'd maintained since the moment they'd met. "Abigail." A sharp whistle cut through the night outside, 3 short bursts that made Cole's entire posture shift instantly to alert readiness. "That's Garrett's signal," he said, already moving toward the window, rifle raised. "Riders approaching from the east road." Abigail's heart leapt into her throat as she watched Cole scan the darkness below. His body tensed and ready, every trace of the gentle vulnerability from moments ago replaced by the hardened focus of a man prepared for violence. "How many?" she whispered. "Can't tell yet." His eyes never left the street. "Stay back from the window." The sound of approaching hooves grew louder, multiple horses moving at a deliberate pace rather than a gallop, and Abigail held her breath as shapes finally emerged from the darkness at the edge of town, illuminated faintly by scattered lamplight from still-lit windows. 3 riders, just as Garrett had warned, moving with the careful confidence of men who believed they'd arrive before anyone expected trouble. But they weren't alone in that darkness. From doorways and alleys along the main street, shapes emerged to meet them. Armed townspeople who'd spent the evening preparing exactly for this moment, rifles raised in the moonlight, blocking the riders' path before they could reach anywhere near the hotel or the jailhouse. "Hold it right there." Garrett's voice carried clear through the night air. "Whatever business Coal Valley sent you here for, it ends right now." The lead rider reined his horse to a stop, clearly startled by the unexpected resistance, his eyes scanning the armed townspeople now surrounding him on every side. "We're just passing through," he said, though his voice carried none of the casual confidence the words implied. "Funny time of night to be passing through Black Ridge," Garrett replied. "Funny coincidence, 3 riders matching Coal Valley's enforcement crew arriving the same night. A federal judge is holding hearings about that very company's crimes." Cole watched from the window above, tension radiating from his entire body. One hand still steady on his rifle should the standoff below turn violent. Abigail stood beside him now, unable to stay back, despite his earlier warning, watching the confrontation with her heart hammering against her ribs. "This isn't your fight," the lead rider said, echoing almost exactly what Whitfield had said at the chapel hours earlier. "Made it our fight the moment your company started murdering folks in this valley," Garrett said. "Now you can turn around and ride back to Helena tonight, or you can explain to Judge Calloway tomorrow exactly what business brought you riding into town under cover of darkness." A tense silence stretched long enough that Abigail thought violence might break out regardless of the odds stacked against the three riders. Then slowly, the lead rider's shoulders sagged, the calculation of impossible odds finally settling visibly across his expression. "This isn't over," he said, though the threat carried little weight given his obvious defeat. "Coal Valley's got more resources than some judge passing through on circuit. You think this changes anything long-term?" "Maybe it doesn't," Garrett said. "But tonight you're riding back the way you came, and tomorrow the truth gets told in front of a federal judge, whether your company likes it or not." The three riders turned their horses, retreating back into the darkness from which they'd come, and Abigail felt the breath she'd been holding finally release in a shaking exhale. "They'll be back," Cole said quietly, lowering his rifle, but not relaxing entirely. "Maybe not tonight, but they won't simply accept defeat without trying something else." "But we held them off. Tonight we did." He turned to face her, fully something complicated moving behind his eyes. "Tomorrow's hearing is going to determine everything, Abigail. If Calloway rules in your favor, if your father's claim is restored, and Coal Valley's crimes are exposed publicly, it changes everything for this entire territory. But if something goes wrong, if Coal Valley finds some way to delay or derail what happens tomorrow, it won't go wrong," Abigail said with more confidence than she entirely felt. "Not after everything we've survived to get here. Not after watching an entire town finally find courage tonight that they'd buried for years." Cole studied her for a long moment, something soft and fierce mixing together in his expression. "You know, 4 days ago I was prepared to die alone in these mountains, still hunting evidence nobody would ever see, still keeping a promise to a dead friend that felt increasingly impossible to fulfill." His voice roughened. "Then a woman walked into a saloon asking for help nobody else would give her, and somehow everything I'd been fighting for 5 years suddenly had a face, a name, a reason that felt real instead of abstract." "Cole, let me finish." His hand found hers, gentle despite its roughness. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Coal Valley tries to throw at us, I need you to know that meeting you changed something in me I'd given up believing could change. You gave this fight meaning again, Abigail. Gave me meaning again." Abigail's breath caught the weight of his words, settling over her with a warmth she hadn't expected to feel amid so much danger and exhaustion. "You're the first person in years who's looked at me and seen someone worth fighting for, instead of someone to dismiss," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you for that." "Don't thank me." His thumb traced gently across her knuckles. "Just survive tomorrow with me. That's all the thanks I need." They stood together at the window for a long while afterward, watching the empty street below. Both of them too aware of the danger still circling them to fully relax, but finding something steadying in each other's presence, despite everything still uncertain ahead. Dawn arrived gray and cold over Black Ridge, and with it came the kind of nervous energy that settled over a town anticipating something momentous. By the time Abigail dressed and made her way downstairs, the streets were already filling with people more than she'd seen since arriving 4 days earlier, drawn by word of the hearing that would finally bring Coal Valley's crimes into the light. Judge Calloway had commandeered the town's largest building for the proceedings, the same saloon where Abigail had been kicked to the floor, now transformed into a makeshift courtroom chairs, arranged in rows, a simple table serving as the judge's bench. Cole found her just outside his expression tight, with the same nervous tension she felt radiating through her own chest. "You ready?" "No," she admitted. "But I'm doing this anyway. That's all any of us can do." His hand found hers briefly, a small gesture of support before they stepped through the doors together into the crowded room. Whitfield sat near the front, hands bound, flanked by Calloway's deputies, his earlier bravado completely extinguished. Beside him sat 2 men Abigail didn't recognize, dressed in the kind of expensive city clothing that marked them immediately as outsiders, Coal Valley's lawyers, having apparently arrived sometime in the early morning hours. "All rise," one of the deputies called out as Calloway entered, taking his seat at the makeshift bench with the same measured authority he'd carried the night before. This hearing concerned serious allegations against Coal Valley Lumber Company. Calloway began, his voice carrying clear and steady across the packed room, including forgery murder and systematic theft of legally registered land claims throughout this territory. "Given the evidence presented to me last night, including a federal land registration journal, believed destroyed in a fire at the Helena Archive. I intend to hear full testimony before rendering judgment. One of Cole Valley's lawyers rose immediately. Your Honor, my client objects to the irregular nature of these proceedings. A hearing convened overnight without proper notice, without opportunity for adequate defense preparation. Your client's company burned an entire archive of federal records 2 years ago. Calloway interrupted his tone, leaving no room for argument. Your client's enforcement crew attempted to silence witnesses just last night, an incident half this town witnessed firsthand. I'd say irregular proceedings are entirely appropriate, given the irregular lengths your client has gone to in order to avoid exactly this moment. The lawyer sat down without further argument, and Abigail felt something steady settle in her chest at the judge's evident lack of patience for Cole Valley's tactics. Miss Harper, Calloway said, turning his attention to her. Please step forward and present your testimony. Abigail rose on legs that felt less steady than she would have liked. But as she moved toward the front of the room, she caught Cole's eyes steady and encouraging, despite his own obvious tension, and felt something in her spine straighten with renewed resolve. She told her story from the beginning, her father's discovery, his excitement, his mysterious death, 2 weeks after registering his claim, the forged signature that had transferred everything to Cole Valley, 3 years of doors closing in her face, every time she tried to seek justice. She spoke of arriving in Black Ridge 4 days ago, of Marshall Whitfield's boot finding her ribs in front of 30 silent witnesses of a stranger rising from the shadows when nobody else would help her. By the time she finished, several people in the crowd were openly weeping, the weight of her testimony landing with the full force of 3 years of suppressed injustice finally given voice. Cole testified next, laying out 5 years of evidence with the careful precision of a man who'd spent every one of those years preparing for exactly this moment, even when he doubted it would ever come. He spoke of Daniel Reyes, of the pattern of murdered surveyors, and forged transfers of an archive fire that conveniently destroyed exactly the records that might have exposed everything years earlier. One by one, townspeople rose to add their own testimony. The blacksmith, the schoolteacher, old ranchers who'd watched neighbors disappear, each account adding another layer of damning evidence against a company that had operated with impunity for years, specifically because everyone had been too afraid to speak. Through it all, Whitfield sat silent. His earlier defiance completely collapsed. While Cole Valley's lawyers grew visibly more desperate, their objections increasingly futile against the overwhelming weight of testimony and physical evidence laid out before the judge. When the final witness finished speaking, Calloway sat in contemplative silence for a long moment, the entire room holding its breath for his judgment. In all my years on the circuit, he finally said, I have rarely encountered such a clear and damning pattern of corruption, violence, and theft as what has been presented to me today. His eyes swept the room, finding Whitfield, finding Cole Valley's lawyers, finding finally Abigail and Cole, standing together near the front. Based on the evidence presented, including the original Federal Land Registration Journal belonging to Thomas Harper, I am restoring full and legal ownership of the disputed valley to Miss Abigail Harper as the rightful heir to her father's legitimate claim. A wave of sound swept through the room, gasps and murmurs, and someone somewhere beginning to clap before catching themselves uncertain whether such celebration was appropriate. Furthermore, Calloway continued, raising his voice over the noise, I am ordering the immediate arrest of all Cole Valley lumber officials connected to this conspiracy, pending full federal investigation into the murder of Thomas Harper, the murder of federal agent Daniel Reyes, and systematic theft of land claims throughout this territory. Marshall Whitfield will face additional charges for attempted destruction of evidence and conspiracy to commit murder. Abigail felt tears finally breaking free as the weight of 3 years lifted entirely from her shoulders, replaced by something she hadn't dared hope to feel again. Justice, finally, impossibly real. Cole's hand found hers, gripping tight, and when she looked up at him, she found his own eyes bright with unshed tears. 5 years of grief and determination finally finding their resolution in this single momentous ruling. We did it, she whispered. You did it, Cole corrected, his voice rough with emotion. Your father's truth finally seeing daylight exactly like you always believed it would. As the courtroom dissolved into celebration around them, townspeople embracing Whitfield being led away in chains. Cole Valley's lawyers gathering their papers in stunned silence. Abigail allowed herself for the first time in 3 years to simply feel the relief of justice finally served. But even amid the celebration, Cole's eyes found Garrett's across the room, and something passed between them, an understanding that this victory, however momentous, still left questions unanswered about exactly how far Cole Valley's corruption truly reached, and whether today's ruling would be the end of the fight or merely its beginning. The celebration in the saloon hadn't even fully settled before Garrett pulled Cole aside, his weathered face still creased with the same concern that had been there the night before. "This ruling's gonna make waves clear to the territorial capital," Garrett said, voice low enough that only Cole and Abigail could hear. "Cole Valley's not some small outfit you can arrest and forget about. They've got investors, partners, men whose names never show up on any deed, but who've been profiting off this scheme for years." "I know," Cole said, his earlier relief already giving way to the same calculating focus Abigail had seen at the chapel. "Calloway's ruling handles Abigail's land and the men directly responsible for what happened here. It doesn't touch whoever's sitting in an office in Helena or further east counting profits from 100 other valleys stolen the same way. So what happens now?" Abigail asked, her earlier joy tempered by the realization that perhaps this victory, however momentous, wasn't quite the ending she'd imagined. "Now," Calloway said, approaching them as the crowd continued celebrating around the periphery of the saloon, "I forward everything we've uncovered here to federal marshals in the territorial attorney's office. Your father's case, Mr. Reyes's murder, the archive fire, all of it becomes part of a larger federal investigation into Cole Valley's full operations." He studied Cole carefully. "Mr. Ashford, given your background and the evidence you've gathered, I suspect federal investigators will want your continued involvement. I've spent 5 years building toward exactly that moment," Cole said. "I'm not stopping now that the door's finally open." Abigail felt something tighten in her chest at his words, an unspoken question forming that she wasn't quite ready to ask. If Cole's fight continued beyond Black Ridge, beyond this single valley, what did that mean for whatever had grown between them these past 4 days? But there wasn't time to dwell on the thought, because Calloway was already moving toward the door, instructing his deputies to secure Whitfield for transport, and the practical business of restoring Abigail's life seemed to demand immediate attention. "Miss Harper," Calloway said, turning back to her, "your father's claim is restored effective immediately. But I imagine you'll need assistance navigating the practical matters, surveys, boundary confirmations, the legal transfer process itself. I can recommend an honest land office clerk in Helena who'll handle the paperwork properly this time. Thank you, Your Honor." Abigail's voice still carried the slight tremor of someone who'd just had 3 years of fighting, suddenly almost overwhelmingly resolved. "I don't know how to properly express what this means." "Don't thank me," Calloway said, echoing words Cole had said to her days earlier. "Thank the man who refused to let this case die for 5 years, and thank your own courage for walking into that saloon, despite knowing exactly what kind of reception you might receive." His eyes moved between her and Cole, with something almost knowing in his expression. Sometimes justice needs more than just evidence and law. Sometimes it needs people stubborn enough to keep fighting when everyone else has given up. The next several hours passed in a blur of practical matters, statements taken for the federal record. Whitfield and Cole Valley's lawyers, escorted out of town under armed guard townspeople, slowly returning to their daily business, even as the shock of the morning's revelations continued rippling through every conversation in Black Ridge. By late afternoon, Abigail found herself standing outside the same hotel that had refused her service days earlier, watching the last of Calloway's procession disappear down the road toward Helena, carrying with them the full weight of evidence that would finally bring federal justice to Cole Valley's broader operations. Cole found her there, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief and something heavier underneath it. "You're quiet," he observed. "I'm trying to understand what happens now," she admitted. 3 years, my entire focus has been getting someone to listen, to believe me, to restore what was stolen. Now that it's actually happened, I don't quite know what comes next." "What do you want to come next?" The question hung between them, simple, but loaded with implications neither of them had directly addressed since the chaos of the past 2 days had consumed every waking moment. Abigail considered her answer carefully, aware that whatever she said next might shape everything that followed. "I want to go back to that valley," she finally said. "Not just to claim it on paper, but to actually see it, walk it, understand what my father saw when he found it that made him so excited to build a future there." She met Cole's eyes. "And I don't want to do that alone if I have a choice in the matter." Something eased in Cole's expression. Tension she hadn't quite realized he was carrying, releasing slightly at her words. "I have to report to federal marshals eventually, give full testimony for the broader investigation. That's not something I can avoid, not after 5 years of building toward this exact opportunity to finally bring everything to light. I understand that, I understand. But it doesn't have to happen today," he continued, "or even this week. Calloway's got the journal, got my evidence files, got enough sworn testimony from half this town to keep federal investigators busy for months before they need anything additional from me directly." His hand found hers, gentle but certain. "I'd like to see that valley too, Abigail. See what your father saw. See what we're actually fighting to protect beyond just papers and legal proceedings." They rode out the following morning, the early light catching gold against frost-tipped grass. As they climbed higher into terrain neither of them had yet seen firsthand, following old survey markers from her father's journal toward the valley itself. Abigail had read the journal a dozen times since retrieving it from that burning chapel, memorized every boundary description, every careful note in her father's familiar handwriting. But nothing had prepared her for actually standing within the landscape itself. The valley opened before them gradually, the trail cresting a final ridge to reveal acres of untouched hardwood forest stretching toward distant peaks, a wide stream cutting silver through stands of oak and maple that her father's notes had described with such evident excitement. "This is it." Abigail breathed, reining her horse to a stop, taking in the full scope of what her father had discovered. What he'd died protecting, what 3 years of fighting had finally restored to her name. "It's beautiful," Cole said quietly beside her, and something in his voice carried genuine awe rather than mere agreement. "I've ridden through a lot of mountain country these past 5 years, but I don't think I've seen timber stands quite like this." "He wrote about it like it was magic," Abigail said, dismounting slowly, her boots sinking slightly into rich earth that had never known the bite of Coal Valley's saws. "Said the hardwood here was unlike anything he'd surveyed before, said it would support 100 families for generations, if managed properly, instead of stripped for quick profit the way most timber companies operated." Cole dismounted beside her, both of them standing together at the edge of the valley, taking in the magnitude of what they'd fought to protect. "What do you want to do with it?" The question settled something into focus that Abigail hadn't fully articulated even to herself until this exact moment, standing in the valley her father had died for, surrounded by exactly the kind of opportunity he'd dreamed of building before everything was stolen from them both. "I want to build something here," she said slowly, the idea taking shape even as she spoke it aloud. "Not just claim ownership and sell timber rights to the highest bidder the way Coal Valley would have done. I want to build something that actually helps people the way my father always intended." "What kind of something?" "A cooperative." Abigail said, the concept crystallizing with each word. "Something owned and worked by the people who actually need it. Widows who've lost husbands to accidents in other companies' mills. Settlers who've been pushed off their own land. The same way I nearly was. Anyone willing to work hard and build something honest instead of watching powerful men profit off other people's suffering." Cole was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression Abigail couldn't quite read. "Your father would be proud," he finally said. "Building something that helps people instead of just enriching yourself, that's exactly the kind of legacy worth fighting for. Will you help me build it?" The question came out more vulnerable than she'd intended, exposing a hope she'd been carefully guarding since the moment Cole had risen from his chair in that saloon. The hope that whatever had grown between them these past days might continue beyond the immediate crisis that had brought them together. Cole's expression softened, something tender breaking through the careful guard he'd maintained even through their most intimate conversations. Abigail, I told you I have obligations to the federal investigation testimony to give evidence to formally hand over. That work isn't finished, and I won't pretend it will be resolved quickly. I understand that. But when it's done, he continued, stepping closer, when I've finally finished the promise I made to Daniel 5 years ago, I can't think of anything I'd rather do than help you build something honest in this valley. Something that proves men like Cole Valley don't get the final word on what justice looks like. Something warm bloomed in Abigail's chest at his words, hope finally allowed to fully surface after years of guarding against exactly this kind of vulnerability. I'd like that, she said softly. I'd like that very much. They spent the rest of the day walking the valley together, Cole helping her identify boundary markers from her father's survey notes. Both of them discussing practical matters that gradually wove together with something deeper. More personal conversations about what each of them had survived, what they hoped to build, who they wanted to become now that the immediate danger had finally passed. The weeks that followed brought their own particular challenges. Federal investigators arriving to take formal statements. Cole testifying extensively about 5 years of evidence, while Abigail navigated the practical reality of restoring legal claim to her father's valley, hiring surveyors, filing proper paperwork through the honest land office clerk Calloway had recommended, slowly transforming abstract justice into concrete reality. Word of what had happened in Black Ridge spread faster than Abigail had anticipated, carried by travelers and newspapers covering the dramatic federal case against Cole Valley Lumber. The corrupt marshal, the murdered surveyor, the outlaw who'd secretly remained a federal agent for 5 years, the woman who'd refused to accept her father's stolen legacy. Some of that attention brought unwelcome curiosity strangers arriving in Black Ridge, hoping to glimpse the people at the center of such a dramatic story. But more of it brought something Abigail hadn't expected. It brought people who needed exactly what she'd promised to build. The first arrived only 2 weeks after Calloway's ruling, a young widow named Martha Coleman, her husband killed in a logging accident at a different company's mill, left with 3 children and no means of supporting them after the company refused any compensation for his death. I heard what happened here, Martha said, standing nervously outside the small office Abigail had established in Black Ridge to handle the valley's administration. Heard you're building something different than what most timber companies offer. I've got nowhere else to turn, and I'm not afraid of hard work. Abigail looked at this woman, exhausted and desperate, but holding herself with the same stubborn dignity Abigail recognized from her own 3 years of fighting, and felt something settle into place that confirmed every instinct that had guided her decision about what to build in her father's valley. We start hiring next month, Abigail said. I can't promise it'll be easy work, but I can promise it'll be honest work, fair wages, and nobody here will ever look at you and decide you're worth less because of circumstances beyond your control. Martha's eyes filled with tears she clearly hadn't expected to shed. Thank you. I don't know how to properly thank you. Don't thank me yet, Abigail said, echoing words that had become something like a personal mantra these past weeks. Thank me once we've actually built something that lasts. More arrived in the following weeks, settlers who'd been pushed off land by companies operating exactly like Cole Valley had injured workers, abandoned by employers who refused responsibility for accidents. Families simply seeking honest opportunity in a territory where powerful interests had spent years ensuring such opportunity remained scarce for anyone without money or connections. Cole returned periodically throughout these weeks, his federal obligations pulling him away for stretches of testimony and evidence review. But he always came back. Always found his way to the valley where Abigail was slowly building something neither of them could have imagined. 4 months earlier, standing together in a saloon that had witnessed her worst humiliation. The investigation's expanding. He told her one evening, sitting together near the first foundation stones, laid for what would become the cooperative's central mill autumn light, slanting gold through hardwood branches, just beginning to turn. Federal marshals found evidence connecting Cole Valley's operations to at least 4 other territories. Similar patterns forged claims murdered surveyors officials paid to look away. How many more families like mine? Abigail asked, though she suspected she already knew the devastating answer. Too many, Cole said grimly. Investigators estimate the conspiracy's been operating for nearly a decade, expanding territory by territory, as Coal Valley's profits funded increasingly sophisticated corruption. He paused. But your case, Abigail. Your father's journal surviving that fire. Your refusal to give up after 3 years of being turned away, that's what finally broke the entire scheme wide open. Investigators are calling it the most significant evidence they've uncovered in the whole investigation. I didn't do it for recognition. I know you didn't. His hand found hers, a gesture that had become natural between them over these months, comfortable in a way that spoke of trust built through shared danger and shared purpose. But it matters what you did. Every family that finally gets justice because of evidence you risked your life to retrieve. That's a legacy worth recognizing, whether you sought recognition or not. As autumn deepened into the kind of cold that warned of approaching winter, the cooperative began taking real shape, the first mill structure rising from foundations. Abigail had watched poured with her own hands, families settling into homes built from the very timber that Coal Valley had once intended to strip and sell for quick profit elsewhere. Martha Coleman's children played near the construction site most afternoons, their laughter carrying across ground that had witnessed murder and corruption only months earlier, now slowly being reclaimed for something honest. But not everyone in the territory welcomed this transformation with open arms. There's talk in Helena, Garrett warned during one of his periodic visits to check on the cooperative's progress. His weathered face creased with the particular concern of a man who'd learned through bitter experience how powerful interests rarely surrendered without continued resistance. Coal Valley's facing federal charges, sure, but the company itself hasn't dissolved entirely. There's investors' partners who weren't directly named in the criminal proceedings, men who lost considerable money when this valley got restored to your name instead of staying under their control. What kind of talk? Cole asked, his earlier relaxation visibly tightening into the same watchful alertness Abigail remembered from their first days together. Talk about discouraging other settlers from joining cooperatives like this one, Garrett said. Talk about making sure this particular experiment fails dramatically enough that nobody else gets ideas about challenging how timber companies have always operated in this territory. Abigail felt old fear flicker through her chest. The particular dread of powerful men who refused to accept that their corruption had finally been exposed and stopped. What does that mean practically? Are we in danger again? I don't know yet, Cole admitted. But I think it means we need to be careful, need to make sure this cooperative succeeds, not just financially, but visibly publicly, in ways that make it impossible for Coal Valley's remaining interests to claim it was some temporary anomaly rather than a genuine alternative to how they've always operated. That conversation marked a shift in how Abigail approached the cooperative's development, no longer simply building something honest for its own sake, but consciously building something that would demonstrate undeniably that an alternative to corruption and exploitation could actually succeed. She began documenting everything meticulously: wages paid, safety measures, implemented profits, shared fairly among workers, rather than concentrated entirely in ownership, creating a record that would prove beyond any doubt that honest business practices could sustain a thriving operation just as effectively as the corruption Coal Valley had relied upon for years. Winter arrived hard and early that year, snow piling deep against the valley's slopes, work slowing but never entirely stopping as the cooperative's families settled into the rhythm of mountain life, supporting each other through hardships that might have broken isolated individuals but somehow felt manageable when shared across a genuine community. Cole spent more time in the valley as winter deepened his federal obligations, easing somewhat as the broader investigation moved from active evidence gathering into the slower process of building formal prosecutions against Coal Valley's remaining leadership. He helped where his particular skills proved useful, tracking game when meat supplies ran low, reading terrain to identify the safest building sites as the cooperative expanded, and increasingly simply being present in ways that had nothing to do with danger or investigation at all. "You don't have to stay," Abigail told him one evening in late winter, both of them sitting near the fire in the small cabin she'd built for herself at the valley's edge, watching snow fall thick and silent outside the window. "I know federal marshals would value your continued involvement, your expertise applied to other territories facing similar corruption. I know I don't have to stay." Cole said, his voice carrying the same steady certainty she'd come to rely upon since that first night in his mountain cabin. "I'm choosing to stay, same as I chose to stand up in that saloon 4 months ago, same as I chose to keep fighting for 5 years before I even knew your name." "Why?" The question came out softer than she intended, vulnerable, in a way she hadn't quite allowed herself to be, even after everything they'd survived together. "Because I spent 5 years fighting for justice in the abstract," Cole said, setting aside the rifle he'd been cleaning to face her fully. Evidence testimony building a case that felt increasingly disconnected from actual people, actual lives, affected by the corruption I was investigating. Then I met you, watched you refuse to give up after 3 years of being dismissed and turned away. Watched you build something honest and good out of land that powerful men had stolen through murder. His eyes held hers steady in the firelight. "You reminded me what the fight was actually for, Abigail. Not abstract justice, but real people, real communities, real lives that deserve better than what corruption and greed typically allow them." "That's not quite answering my question," she said, though her voice carried warmth rather than challenge. Something shifted in Cole's expression. Vulnerability she rarely glimpsed from a man who'd spent 5 years carefully guarding every emotion that might compromise his survival. "I'm staying because somewhere in these past 4 months, watching you build this cooperative, watching you transform tragedy into something that helps dozens of families now and will help hundreds more in years ahead, I realized I'd rather build a life here beside you than continue chasing federal investigations across territories that will always have more corruption waiting to be exposed." Abigail felt her breath catch the weight of his words, settling over her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. "Cole, I'm not finished," he said, though gently. "I know this isn't the kind of dramatic gesture men in dime novels make, no grand declaration delivered on bent knee. I'm not even sure I have the right words for everything I'm trying to say." He reached across the small distance between them, his hand finding hers with the same gentle certainty he'd shown since that first night helping her up from the saloon floor. "But I know that watching you these past months, watching your strength, and your stubborn refusal to let injustice stand unchallenged. Watching you build something beautiful out of everything that was stolen from you. I've fallen in love with you, Abigail Harper. Completely. Certainly in a way I never expected to feel again, after everything I survived these past 5 years." Tears gathered in Abigail's eyes, though they carried none of the pain that had defined so much of her life these past 3 years. "I think I fell in love with you the moment you rose from that chair in the saloon," she admitted softly. "Watching you stand up when nobody else would, watching you choose to help a stranger, despite the obvious danger to yourself, I'd never seen anything like that kind of courage and kindness combined in one person before." Cole's hand tightened around hers, and for a long moment, neither spoke the silence comfortable and warm, despite the snow falling thick outside the cabin's windows. Despite the long road both of them had traveled to reach this exact moment together. "I don't have much to offer you," Cole finally said. "No land of my own, no fortune, just 5 years of hard-won evidence, and a reputation that's only recently begun, shifting from outlaw back toward honest man. I don't need fortune," Abigail said, her voice steady, despite the emotion thick in her throat. "I need someone who sees me clearly, who values my strength, instead of dismissing it because of how I look, who fights beside me, instead of expecting me to simply accept whatever circumstances powerful men decide to hand me." She squeezed his hand. "I think I've already found exactly that in you, Cole Ashford. I don't need anything more than what you've already given me these past months." As winter gradually surrendered to spring, the cooperative's success became impossible for even Coal Valley's remaining interests to ignore or dismiss. The first full timber harvest conducted with sustainable practices that protected the valley's long-term health, rather than stripping it for immediate profit, yielded enough income to fully support every family working the operation, while still generating surplus that allowed for expansion. New families welcomed new opportunities created. Martha Coleman's eldest son, barely 12 years old when his family first arrived, seeking refuge from corporate negligence, began apprenticing under the cooperative's master carpenter, learning skills that would secure his family's future for generations to come. Other families found similar opportunities, Injured workers training for less physically demanding roles in the cooperative's expanding administration. Widows discovering unexpected talents in everything from bookkeeping to timber assessment. You've built something remarkable, Judge Calloway observed during a visit that spring surveying the cooperative's expanding operations with evident satisfaction. I've seen plenty of timber operations throughout my circuit, but never one quite like this where the workers themselves share genuinely in the profits, where safety and fair treatment aren't sacrificed for quick returns. My father envisioned something like this, Abigail told him. Watching workers move efficiently through the mill yard, families who'd arrived with nothing now building real futures through honest labor. I just finally had the opportunity to make his vision real. The federal investigation's reached its conclusion, by the way. Calloway added, his expression growing more serious. Coal Valley's leadership has been fully prosecuted, sentences handed down for conspiracy murder and systematic land theft across 5 territories. The company itself has been dissolved entirely, its remaining assets distributed toward restitution for victims, wherever such restitution remains possible. Abigail felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering grief at this news, justice finally complete, but unable to fully restore what had been lost. Her father's life chief among the losses, no legal proceeding could ever truly remedy. What about Whitfield? She asked. Convicted on multiple charges, sentenced to federal prison for the remainder of his natural life, Calloway said. He'll never threaten anyone again, never wield power he so thoroughly abused throughout his tenure as marshal. That evening, Abigail shared the news with Cole as they walked together through the cooperative's expanding grounds, spring wildflowers blooming thick along paths that had been bare earth only months earlier. It's finally over, she said, though her voice carried the particular weight of someone processing complicated emotions rather than simple celebration. 5 years of your fight, 3 years of mine, finally resolved completely. Not entirely over, Cole said gently. Your father's still gone. Daniel's still gone. Nothing about today's news brings either of them back. He took her hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing. But their deaths finally mean something, finally led toward justice, instead of simply being buried under corruption and silence. That matters, even though it doesn't erase the grief. You're right, Abigail said, leaning into his familiar warmth. I think I needed reminding that closure doesn't mean forgetting, just means finally being able to move forward without that grief defining every single day. As summer approached, the cooperative celebrated its first full year since Calloway's original ruling, the community gathering for a celebration that brought together everyone whose lives had been transformed by Abigail's refusal to accept her father's stolen legacy as permanent. Martha Coleman's family, now thoroughly established and thriving. Other widows and settlers who'd found genuine opportunity rather than mere charity. Townspeople from Black Ridge itself, many of whom had initially stayed silent during Abigail's worst humiliation, but had since found their own courage, reflected in the cooperative's ongoing success. Garrett attended as well, his role in rallying the town's eventual resistance against Coal Valley, earning him a position helping coordinate the cooperative's relationship with neighboring communities, ensuring the model Abigail had built could potentially expand to help even more families throughout the territory. Never thought I'd see something like this when you first rode into Black Ridge. Garrett told Abigail during the celebration, watching children play freely across ground that had witnessed such violence and corruption only a year earlier. Town that nearly let Whitfield kick you to death on a saloon floor, now hosting a celebration for the cooperative you built from that very tragedy. People can change, Abigail said, watching the same townspeople who'd once looked away now laughing and celebrating alongside families they'd helped rescue from similar exploitation. Sometimes they just need to see that courage is actually possible, that standing up against corruption doesn't have to end in tragedy. As evening settled over the celebration, lanterns lit throughout the cooperative's central yard, music carrying from a small group of musicians among the workers, Cole found Abigail standing near the very foundation stones where he'd first told her he loved her months earlier, now surrounded by the thriving mill structure that had grown from that conversation. I have something to ask you, he said, his expression carrying a nervousness she'd rarely witnessed from a man who'd faced down armed marshals without flinching. Cole, he reached into his coat, producing a small ring fashioned from simple silver, clearly crafted by hand, rather than purchased from some distant jeweler. "I'm not a wealthy man," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He was clearly fighting to control. "Don't have much to offer beyond what you already know about me. My history, my commitment to justice, my determination to build something honest in whatever years remain ahead of me." "Cole, what are you?" "I'm asking you to marry me," he said simply, dropping to one knee, despite the dirt and the gathered crowd slowly noticing what was unfolding. "I love you, Abigail Harper. Love your strength, your stubbornness, your refusal to accept injustice as simply the way things have to be. Love watching you build something beautiful out of tragedy. Love the family we've created together here in this valley, even though we're not yet officially bound by anything more than choice and commitment." Tears streamed freely down Abigail's face, now the entire celebration falling into hushed silence, as more people noticed the moment unfolding near the mill's foundation. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying clear across the suddenly quiet yard. "Yes, Cole Ashford, I'll marry you." The crowd erupted into cheering as Cole rose to slip the ring onto her finger, pulling her into an embrace that spoke of everything they'd survived together. Every danger faced, every doubt overcome, finally culminating in a commitment neither of them had dared hope for when they'd first met, amid violence and humiliation in that saloon a year earlier. They married that autumn, a simple ceremony held at the cooperative itself, surrounded by the community they'd built together. Martha Coleman serving as Abigail's attendant, Garrett standing as witness for Cole, the entire valley, gathering to celebrate a union that represented everything they'd all fought to achieve. Justice, restored communities, rebuilt love, discovered amid circumstances that might have broken people less determined to find hope despite tragedy. Years passed, the cooperative growing steadily into one of the most respected timber operations throughout Montana, known not just for quality lumber, but for fair treatment, safety, and genuine opportunity for anyone willing to work honestly. Martha Coleman's children grew into adults who'd never known the desperate poverty that had first brought their family to the valley, instead inheriting skills and opportunities that secured their futures for generations. Abigail herself, transformed from the desperate woman who'd once been kicked across a saloon floor into a respected community leader, her name synonymous throughout the territory. With the kind of justice and opportunity that proved corruption and exploitation weren't simply inevitable features of frontier business, but choices that honest people could refuse to accept. Cole eventually completed his federal obligations entirely, his testimony helping secure convictions not just against Cole Valley, but against the broader network of corruption that had enabled the company's crimes across multiple territories. He returned permanently to the valley, building a genuine life alongside Abigail that bore no resemblance to the hunted, isolated existence he'd endured during his 5 years as a supposed outlaw. One autumn evening, years after that first dramatic confrontation in Black Ridge, Cole and Abigail stood together beside the cooperative's now thriving mill, watching their own children play nearby, alongside Martha Coleman's grandchildren, the entire valley alive with the kind of prosperity and genuine community that Thomas Harper had envisioned but never lived to see. "You asked for help that night," Cole said, watching the golden evening light settle across timber stands that had grown from tragedy into genuine triumph. "I think you saved more people than anyone ever saved you." Abigail smiled, leaning into his familiar warmth, watching their shared legacy thrive around them. "No," she said softly. "We saved this place together." As the sun set fully over the Rocky Mountains, painting the valley in brilliant gold and crimson, Black Ridge would never again be remembered as merely the town where a desperate woman was once kicked across a saloon floor, while 30 witnesses looked away in fear. Instead, it would forever be known as the place where one woman's unbreakable courage met one man's unwavering integrity, where corruption finally crumbled before truth, and where two people who'd been told by the world they weren't worth fighting for proved beyond any doubt that true strength was never measured by violence or power, but by the courage to stand beside someone else when every easy choice would have been to simply walk away. Their legacy endured not in monuments or wealth, but in every family. The cooperative continued to support every child who grew up knowing dignity and opportunity instead of desperation. Every person throughout that territory who learned that even the most powerful corruption could be defeated when enough courageous people refused to accept injustice as simply the way things had to be. And in the quiet moments after each long day's honest work, as autumn light faded gently into evening across the valley, Thomas Harper had died, protecting Cole and Abigail. Ashford remained exactly what they'd promised each other from the very beginning. Partners in every sense that mattered. Proof that love built on mutual respect and shared purpose could outlast any tragedy, any corruption, any attempt by powerful men to convince good people that standing up for what was right simply wasn't worth the risk. The valley flourished, the cooperative thrived, and the truth that had once been buried beneath murder and forgery and 3 years of dismissive silence stood now as Montana's most enduring proof that justice, however long delayed, would always eventually find its way into the light.